I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The orchestra was still playing when the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace suddenly changed. Before hundreds of distinguished guests, Queen Camilla stepped directly into Princess Anne's path and delivered a cutting accusation that no one expected to hear in public. Anne did not retreat. Her expression hardened, her hands went still, and the royal gala became the setting for a confrontation powerful enough to expose years of private resentment within the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Ambassadors, military leaders, charity patrons, and senior figures had gathered for a carefully managed diplomatic reception. A royal gala is a formal gathering designed to honor service and display unity. That unity now looked dangerously fragile. Princess Anne had been overseeing the ceremonial program, the planned order of introductions and official duties, for guests linked to organizations once supported by Queen Elizabeth II. For her, this was duty tied directly to her mother's legacy. Camilla moved closer beside the main receiving line and accused Anne of deliberately ignoring a revised palace instruction. She then demanded that the Princess Royal step away from the introductions immediately. The words landed hard. Anne turned slowly, lowered her voice, and told the Queen that she would not be corrected publicly for carrying out duties already authorized by the sovereign. The receiving line is the formal order in which royal guests are greeted, and disrupting it can expose division instantly. Nearby conversations stopped. Charles heard everything. The king stood nearby, caught between his wife and sister, yet did not intervene. Anne looked toward him once, waiting for him to confirm the arrangement he had officially approved. Nothing came. That silence wounded her more deeply than Camilla's accusation. She had served the crown for decades, and now her brother allowed that loyalty to be questioned before strangers. The confrontation had not been spontaneous. Earlier that evening, Camilla's private secretary had delivered a revised order transferring part of Anne's authority to the Queen's office. A private secretary is the senior aide who manages official instructions and access, making the alteration more serious than a misunderstanding. Anne suspected the change had never received Charles's full approval. She refused to create a larger spectacle. Anne stepped away, found her trusted equerry, and whispered that the original instructions must be placed on the king's desk before midnight. An equerry is a royal aide responsible for personal and ceremonial support. The clash lasted less than a minute, but the papers now moving through the palace would expose why neither woman was willing to surrender, and why Charles could no longer remain silent. To the guests inside the palace, the confrontation appeared to be a dispute over protocol. To Anne and Camilla, it represented something far deeper. One woman had spent her life serving the crown without asking for affection. The other had fought for decades to secure her place beside the sovereign. When those two paths collided beneath the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace, neither duty nor family loyalty could disguise the personal wounds beneath the argument. Princess Anne had built her reputation through relentless service, difficult journeys, military commitments, and years of public duty performed without complaint. The crown, meaning the institution of the monarchy, rather than the physical object, had shaped almost every decision she made. Anne believed authority came from consistency. Titles mattered, but work mattered more. That belief made Camilla's public order feel like more than an insult. It felt like an attempt to erase everything she had earned. Anne entered a quiet palace antechamber and pulled one glove from her hand with slow, controlled force. An antechamber is a small waiting room beside a larger formal space, often used by royals between official duties. She did not shout. She did not call for Charles. Instead, she stood alone, humiliated by the confrontation and even more wounded by her brother's refusal to defend her. Her anger was sharp, but the sadness beneath it was deeper. Camilla closed the door of her private sitting room moments later and turned toward her secretary. The Queen asked whether the nearby guests had heard Anne's reply. Her voice remained steady, but the question exposed fear. She had survived years of public hostility before taking her place beside the sovereign, and she now guarded that position fiercely. To her, Anne's refusal was not merely stubbornness, it was a challenge to the authority she had fought to secure. Charles felt the pressure from both sides. The king loved his sister's honesty and trusted her loyalty, yet he also believed defending his wife was part of protecting the current reign. Every choice carried a cost. Supporting Anne could humiliate Camilla. Supporting the Queen could destroy the bond with the sister who had stood beside him during the monarchy's darkest transitions. William had already sensed the danger. During recent planning meetings, the prince privately warned a senior aide that the tension between the two women was becoming impossible to contain. That warning was preserved in the aide's documented account of the meeting. The future king had noticed how each disagreement returned to the same hidden question. Who had the right to interpret Queen Elizabeth's final ceremonial wishes? The Gala clash was only the explosion. The real conflict had begun weeks earlier, when one deliberate decision at Windsor transformed quiet resentment into a struggle neither woman could forgive. The crisis at Buckingham Palace did not begin beneath the glare of the Gala chandeliers. It began 3 weeks earlier inside a smaller dining room at Windsor Castle, where a commemorative luncheon was being planned in honor of Queen Elizabeth II. One altered seating card, one disputed instruction, and one sentence spoken before senior courtiers turned a routine planning session into the moment Anne and Camilla stopped viewing each other as difficult relatives and began viewing each other as rivals. Anne entered the luncheon expecting a practical discussion. Camilla sat beside Charles, while 2 senior courtiers and several representatives reviewed plans connected to the late Queen's charitable legacy. A commemorative luncheon is a formal meal held to honor a person or historic event, and this one carried deep emotional weight because many guests had worked with Elizabeth for decades. Anne had been chosen to present the military and charity representatives because she knew their service personally. Camilla reached across the table and moved Anne's place card away from the central position. Then she announced that the Queen's office would control every introduction linked to the memorial program. A place card identifies where each guest sits, but inside royal planning, its position can also signal status and authority. The movement looked small. Its meaning was not. Anne set down her glass and asked Charles whether he had approved the change. Her tone stayed calm, but the question exposed the tension instantly. The king hesitated before admitting that he had not reviewed the final arrangement. That answer left Camilla isolated in front of the room, and the silence that followed made her embarrassment impossible to hide. Camilla's face tightened. She insisted that her position gave her the right to prevent competing chains of command inside the household. A chain of command is the clear order showing who gives instructions and who must follow them. She argued that Anne's independent role created confusion. Anne answered that decades of service were not confusion, and that altering an approved plan without the sovereign's consent was not unity. Charles tried to lower the temperature, but neither woman had forgotten the exchange. Later that evening, Anne received a documented copy of the original planning program through her equerry. It carried the king's approval and confirmed that her ceremonial role had already been authorized before Camilla's office attempted to remove it. Anne refused to challenge the Queen publicly at Windsor. Instead, she instructed her aide to preserve every version of the program, every amendment, and every note attached to it. That quiet decision would later become decisive. By the time they entered Buckingham Palace weeks later, the disagreement was no longer about introductions. It was about whether Anne would submit to Camilla's authority before the entire royal household, and whether Charles would finally choose a side. The ballroom doors had opened, the guests were moving toward the receiving line, and every detail appeared perfectly controlled. Then Camilla crossed the polished floor and blocked Anne's path. There were no private secretaries between them, no closed doors, and no time for carefully prepared language. What followed was a direct collision between royal rank and royal endurance, witnessed by people trained never to react, and remembered by everyone who heard it. Princess Anne was preparing to introduce a decorated military guest whose organization had been supported by Queen Elizabeth II for more than 40 years. The receiving line, the formal order in which important guests are presented to senior royals, carried special meaning that evening because it linked the current reign to the late monarch's decades of service. Anne knew the guest personally. She also knew exactly what Charles had authorized. Camilla approached without hesitation and placed one hand lightly against Anne's forearm. The gesture appeared controlled, but the words that followed cut through the polite conversation around them. "You were instructed to step aside," she said, clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. The Queen expected compliance. Instead, she met resistance. Anne removed Camilla's hand and held her gaze. "I was instructed by the sovereign, not corrected by your office." Her voice remained low, but every word carried force. The sovereign is the reigning monarch whose approval gives official authority to royal duties. By invoking Charles directly, Anne was not only rejecting Camilla's order, she was questioning whether the Queen had acted without the king's consent. Camilla's expression tightened. She accused Anne of repeatedly undermining palace unity and treating her authority as optional. The charge struck at something deeply personal. Anne had spent decades protecting the monarchy through difficult engagements and military commitments, while Camilla had spent years fighting to make her own place within it unquestionable. Neither woman was prepared to be diminished. Charles heard the exchange and stepped forward. Then he stopped. The king looked from his sister to his wife, but Camilla warned him that the matter concerned respect for the crown. He remained silent again, and Anne understood the message immediately. Her brother would not defend her in front of the room. Anne's equerry stood nearby, holding both versions of the Gala program. One carried Charles's approval. The other contained the revised instruction issued by Camilla's private secretary. An equerry is a royal aide who provides personal and ceremonial support, and the papers in his hands had become more powerful than any spoken accusation. Anne refused to continue the argument before the guest. She bowed slightly toward Charles, stepped away from the line, and delivered one final warning. "You will have the papers before the evening is over." She had left the ballroom, but the confrontation was not finished. The documents, now moving toward the king's private study, would force Charles to decide whether marriage, rank, or written authority truly controlled the palace. Shortly before midnight, a red folder was placed before King Charles in his private study. Inside were two versions of the same Gala instructions. One carried his approval. The other transferred Anne's responsibilities to Camilla's office without his signature. The confrontation that had embarrassed the monarchy was suddenly no longer a disagreement between two strong women. It had become a test of whether decisions were being made in the king's name without his full consent. Charles sat alone at his desk and removed his glasses. He read both versions line by line, searching for the exact point where his authority had been altered. The original program authorized Anne to conduct the ceremonial introductions. The revised order instructed palace staff to defer to the Queen's private office. A ceremonial program is the official plan controlling who performs each formal duty, so changing it could shift power without making a public announcement. The king recognized his initials on the first document immediately. He found no signature on the second. His private secretary waited across the room, watching him place the revised paper down with unusual care. A private secretary is a senior royal aide who manages official correspondence and instructions. Charles said nothing, but his silence now carried anger rather than hesitation. Charles summoned Camilla and ordered that no aides remain in the room. When the Queen entered, he asked one direct question. Had she personally approved the alteration before the Gala? She did not deny it. Instead, She argued that Anne had begun operating like an independent center of authority, creating confusion over who controlled events connected to the current reign. Camilla defended the decision as protection, not ambition. She reminded him that every public disagreement weakened her position and encouraged courtiers to treat her authority as temporary. The Queen believed Anne's influence came not only from rank, but from decades of loyalty surrounding her. That made the Princess Royal difficult to challenge and even harder to control. Charles listened until his wife mentioned the wording used in the revised order. Then the king returned to the document. Camilla's private secretary had used language normally reserved for instructions approved jointly by the sovereign and queen. The sovereign is the reigning monarch, whose consent gives such directions their authority. Charles had never approved the amendment. His name had been implied where his permission did not exist. The king finally issued a firm order. No ceremonial change could be released in his name, again without written authorization. Camilla's office would be restricted immediately, but he postponed any judgment on her conduct until morning. Charles had stopped the hidden use of his authority. He had not repaired the deeper damage. Before the palace doors opened again, Anne would make a decision that showed exactly what his public silence had cost. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Princess Anne made a decision more powerful than any public argument. She did not release a statement. She did not demand an apology. Instead, she canceled her attendance at an upcoming palace reception and temporarily stepped away from planning events connected to the late Queen's legacy. Within hours, the royal household understood what her silence meant. Anne was no longer prepared to carry responsibility while others questioned her authority. Anne sat at Gatcombe Park with a short briefing note placed before her. She read it once, drew a firm line through 2 upcoming palace engagements, and handed the page back to her secretary. Gatcombe Park is her private country home, a place far removed from the machinery of Buckingham Palace. That distance mattered. Here, she could decide without courtiers watching every movement or interpreting every pause. The Princess Royal made her position precise. She would continue her independent charity visits, military duties, and public commitments, but she would no longer take part in ceremonial planning, controlled jointly by Camilla's office. Ceremonial planning means organizing the formal duties, guest order, and royal roles attached to official events. Anne was not abandoning service. She was refusing to serve under instructions that could be changed without warning and used to humiliate her. Anne paused beside a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth II. Her anger weakened for one quiet moment, revealing the sadness beneath it. In a private conversation documented by her secretary, she admitted that she had never expected to feel unwelcome inside her mother's palace. The words were simple, but they carried decades of loyalty, sacrifice, and grief. Camilla received the cancellation notice during breakfast. She set down her cup and asked whether the withdrawal would be seen as a protest against her. The Queen understood the danger immediately. Anne's silence could speak more loudly than any public accusation, especially because military organizations and long-serving charities trusted her deeply. Charles felt the consequences before the morning briefing ended. Several senior courtiers warned the king that losing his sister's involvement would weaken continuity with the late Queen's reign. Courtiers are senior palace officials who advise and support the royal household. They also cautioned that military groups loyal to Anne might view the dispute as proof that long service no longer carried protection. William read the cancellation notice twice. The prince then requested a private meeting with his aunt before speaking to his father. He knew the conflict had moved beyond protocol. It had become a test of whether the family could still tell the truth to one another. Anne accepted his request on one condition: no private secretaries, no written agenda, no attempt to pretend the gala had never happened. For the first time since the confrontation, she was ready to speak openly, but only to the one person who understood that silence inside the monarchy could become more dangerous than scandal. There were no courtiers inside the room. when Prince William met Princess Anne. No documents were placed between them, and no palace language softened what had happened. William closed the door, sat opposite his aunt, and asked a single question. Was she leaving because of Camilla's accusation, or because Charles had remained silent? Anne's answer shifted the entire conflict, revealing that her deepest wound had not been public embarrassment. It had been abandonment by her own brother. William chose a modest sitting room at Windsor, far from the formal offices where every sentence could become part of an official record. A courtier is a senior palace official who advises or assists the royal household, but none had been allowed inside. The prince wanted honesty without interruption. Anne wanted the same. The future king spoke carefully. He told his aunt that her withdrawal had frightened people who depended on her steadiness, especially military organizations and charities connected to the late Queen's reign. Those groups saw Anne as continuity in human form. If she stepped away, many would believe the monarchy no longer valued service built over decades. Anne did not answer immediately. Then she admitted that Camilla's accusation had angered her, but Charles's hesitation had wounded her more deeply. The king knew she had followed his approved instructions. He also knew the revised order carried no signature. Yet when the moment came, her brother had allowed silence to protect him while leaving her exposed. William lowered his voice and acknowledged the truth. Palace unity could not survive if private loyalty demanded public silence. Written authority had been misused, and pretending otherwise would turn one confrontation into a pattern. The future king understood that this was not simply about Anne's pride. It was about whether anyone inside the family could trust an instruction carrying Charles's name. Anne made her terms clear. She did not demand Camilla's removal, public humiliation, or loss of title. She wanted a firm division of responsibilities and a direct acknowledgement that the confrontation had been wrong. A division of responsibilities means clearly defining who controls each royal duty, so power cannot be quietly shifted again. William promised to place those conditions before Charles. He also warned that the king must deliver the decision himself. No secretary, no carefully drafted message, no attempt to hide behind palace language. Anne finally agreed to return for one memorial engagement, but only if her brother resolved the matter before the invitations were issued. Her voice remained calm, yet the boundary was absolute. William left carrying no folder and no formal mandate. Still, the truth Anne had given him offered Charles one final chance to repair the family before private pain became a national judgment. By the following morning, the confrontation no longer belonged to Buckingham Palace. A photograph taken seconds after the exchange showed Anne walking away with a rigid expression, while Camilla remained beside the receiving line and Charles stared between them. That single image crossed front pages, television screens, and social media feeds. The public did not see a disagreement over protocol. It saw a family divided, and a monarchy struggling to decide whose service truly commanded respect. One newspaper placed the image across its entire front page, beneath the headline, "Royal Rift in the Ballroom." Anne appeared alone in motion while Camilla and Charles remained behind, and that contrast became the story. A front page is the main page of a newspaper, where editors place the issue they believe matters most. The image turned a private power struggle into a national symbol of loyalty, authority, and silence. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace before midday. Several people held photographs of Queen Elizabeth II, while others spoke openly about Anne's decades of military and charity work. When her car briefly passed the gates, applause broke out. The moment was short, but it showed how quickly public sympathy had shifted toward the woman who had walked away rather than deepen the spectacle. A national broadcaster described the dispute as a struggle between inherited loyalty and newly established authority. The phrase spread because it captured the deeper conflict. Anne represented decades of service linked to the late Queen. Camilla represented the authority of the current reign. The argument was no longer about who introduced a guest. It was about what kind of service the monarchy valued most. Camilla watched the coverage alone and lowered the television volume. The Queen had expected criticism, but not the sense that Anne's withdrawal had become a moral judgment against her. She understood that every replay made her public confrontation appear less like discipline and more like humiliation. Charles grew increasingly distressed as advisors explained the danger. The king had believed silence would preserve dignity, yet the public now saw it as weakness and unwillingness to defend his sister. That judgment struck at his authority, because a monarch who could not control conflict inside his own family appeared unable to control the institution around him. William entered with Anne's conditions and placed them before his father. The prince urged Charles to decide privately before the communications team drafted another empty statement. He warned that palace language would only deepen the damage. Charles dismissed the press advisors. Then he ordered Camilla and Anne to be brought into the same room. The king made his choice clear. The resolution would come from the family, not the press office. The world had already chosen its symbols, but Charles still had one chance to replace a public wound with a final act of accountability. The final meeting did not begin with anger. It began with Charles placing both versions of the gala program on a table between Anne and Camilla. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the king acknowledged what he should have said inside the ballroom. Anne had followed his authorized instruction. Camilla's office had exceeded its authority, and his own silence had allowed a private dispute to become a public humiliation. At last, responsibility was spoken plainly. Charles faced his sister and apologized without hiding behind palace language. The king admitted that he had heard the confrontation, understood that Anne was acting under his approval, and still failed to intervene. The gala program is the official document assigning duties during a formal event, which meant the papers before them proved exactly who had been authorized to act. He told her that his silence had protected no one. It had only deepened the wound. Anne accepted the apology, but she refused to make the moment comfortable. She told Charles that loyalty to the crown could never require surrendering personal dignity. The crown means the monarchy as an institution, not merely the person wearing it, and she had served that institution for decades. Her voice remained controlled. Her message did not. Service without respect, she warned, eventually becomes exploitation. Camilla finally acknowledged her part. The Queen admitted that she had authorized the revised instruction because she believed Anne was resisting her authority and encouraging others to do the same. She also accepted that confronting her publicly had been wrong. The confession was preserved in a documented account prepared after the private meeting, ensuring the decision could not later be rewritten as a simple misunderstanding. Anne answered with quiet resolve. Respect, she said, could not be secured through humiliation. Royal authority became weaker when it was used to settle personal resentment. Because every private wound eventually damaged the institution both women claimed to protect. Camilla did not argue. For the first time, she listened. Charles then delivered the final ruling. Ceremonial responsibilities linked to Queen Elizabeth II's long-standing charities and military associations would remain under Anne's leadership. Camilla's office would oversee events connected directly to the current reign. Every future joint instruction would require the king's written approval, and no private secretary could imply his consent without confirmation. Anne returned for the memorial engagement. Camilla received her without obstruction, while Charles stood beside them and allowed responsibility, not pretense, to restore order. The gala had exposed how quickly authority could become personal, but its resolution delivered a clear verdict. Anne's fury was not rebellion. It was a defense of service, dignity, and the truth that no crown is strengthened by public humiliation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.